Baby, baby.
Greetings, listeners. It's your boy NotoriousSA, aka Steve Anderson, aka Mr. Library. Doing something new to try to make this work. I've been able to, now the library is open again, I can finally rent out a room and have a quiet place to sit and record. So I'm going to try to do this again, because I spent a significant amount of time on this already, and due to multiple issues, I had to throw out everything I previously recorded already. So this time, we're going to be a little bit slower, more thorough, but this is also going to be a different podcast from what I normally do. If you've listened before, you've probably it's mostly political stuff and current events with some investigative work, but for this I wanted to do a bit of a culture binge. Something I haven't really talked about much before. I've talked about some entertainment, but not a lot. But there's a particular show that's been on TV that I became a fan of, and I later also became a fan of the source material, the graphic novel. That show is called Y, The Last Man. So the letter Y, The Last Man. And it's obviously from the title of the episode, you can tell I'm going to be reviewing it. So, spoilers ahead for anybody who hasn't seen the show and plans on watching it or wants to watch or hasn't finished it, or if you haven't read the graphic novels. But the graphic novels came out in the 2000s, and the show finished up its season on Sunday, so I think most people are caught up by now. So spoilers ahead, but fair warning. So what is this thing that I'm talking about? First I saw the previews for it on TV, and I watched the first episode of the show called Y, The Last Man, and I found the premise interesting. So I ended up I tried to find the actual graphic novels in the library, but someone had already beat me to the punch, so I had to wait a bit. But I was able to find a playlist on YouTube, which I have put in the description of this episode, and it does cover the entirety of the series, even though the artwork is slightly blocked out because the words are. It has all the pictures, and the guy reads all the captions, so you get sort of the same effect. But let me give you a little bit of a summary. This is from the actual, I have with me the graphic novel, so this is book 1, which is some of the first issues in the series. It's called Welcome to the Unmanned World, and this is after some initial action has happened. This gives you a brief breakdown of the scenario of the story. In the summer of 2002, a plague of unknown origin destroyed every last sperm, fetus, and fully developed mammal with a Y chromosome, with the apparent exception of one young man and his pet, a male capuchin monkey. This gendercide instantaneously exterminated 48% of the global population, or approximately 2.9 billion men. 495 of the Fortune 500 CEOs are now dead, as are 99% of the world's landowners. In the United States alone, more than 95% of all commercial pilots, truck drivers, and ship captains died, as did 92% of all violent felons. Internationally, 99% of all mechanics, electricians, and construction workers are now deceased, though 51% of the planet's agricultural labor force is still alive. 14 nations, including Spain and Germany, have women soldiers who have served in ground combat units. None of the United States' nearly 200,000 female troops have ever participated in ground combat. Australia, Norway, and Sweden are the only countries that have women serving on board submarines. In Israel, all women between the ages of 18 and 26 have performed compulsory military service in the Israeli Defense Force for at least 1 year and 9 months. Before the plague, at least 3 Palestinian suicide bombers had been women. Worldwide, 85% of all government representatives are now dead, as are 100% of Catholic priests, Muslim imams, and Orthodox Jewish rabbis. So the graphic novel takes place in 2002, and for those of us who were alive at the time and old enough to remember America as it was back in 2002, it's the post 9/11 atmosphere of patriotism and paranoia. I didn't read this when it came out, and I was not aware of it till the TV show came out, but honestly, I'm glad the TV show did come out, because now I'm a fan. But, so the story basically revolves around, in the graphic novel, 2002, and the accompanying TV show, which is, my understanding is it takes place in the present day. What happens is that every mammal with a Y chromosome suddenly collapses and dies. So, there's been a lot of commentary about this from other people I've watched, and I think there's some sort of popular-ish right-wing trope about the show being too woke, and therefore it's, not successful. And what I will say is that the TV show does have key differences from the graphic novel, some of which I'm not 100% as to why the changes were made, but if it were up to me, they would just make the graphic novel shot for shot in TV. But maybe they don't want to do that, which is fine. The world is different, and to say that we could just replicate 2002 and 2021 obviously wouldn't be a fair assessment. And I think, for a lot of people, the graphic novel itself focuses mostly on the main character of the book. His name is Yorick Brown. And I have included this in the description as well if you want to read. There's a bit of a good synopsis here in the LA Times about what happens. So basically, this is in the description if you want to read it, but the main character of the story, his name is Yorick Brown. It's like Yo-Rick. Yorick. It's a Shakespeare name. And his pet monkey, Ampersand. Ampersand, like the thing in English class that you learned and forgot, but it's above the 7 on your keyboard. Or is the 7 on your keyboard if you got a Chromebook like I do. Are the only 2 mammals that survive this plague apocalypse. And the book and the graphic novel give a multitude of possibilities as to what caused it, and it does far later on in the series reveal why these 2 particular characters, the monkey and the man, were able to survive this particular plague. So without going too far into details, right, this man and his monkey by chance get together, and because of that he's able to survive this massive quote-unquote gendercide. And one of the things that I found interesting, and this is noticed in the book and the series as well, is that while the graphic novel focuses mostly on the tale of the main character, Yorick Brown, and 2 of his sidekicks, a woman named Agent 355 and another woman named Dr. Allison Mann, the TV show definitely dives into other stories that are happening in the world, and I think that kind of world building can be helpful for helping people kind of dive into a show. Because obviously, if you're a fan of the novel, right, the whole point is that you're following this guy, Yorick Brown, as he tries to navigate across the country in what is essentially a post-apocalyptic world. Now, when we think about the destruction that's going on here, and then the TV show, if you've seen it, you maybe get a sense of it, and if you've read the graphic novels, you caught the very, in my opinion, well done opening. But essentially, they're is complete and total chaos for most of the world when the plague hits. As it's mentioned earlier, large parts of society, which includes the people who fix planes, the people who fly the planes, and the people who direct the planes, all die instantaneously. So, if you're up in the air, unless there's a female pilot or somebody who can fly the plane, it's probably going to be bad news bears for you. Not to mention the fact that this is also pointed out in the show as well, which I thought was interesting. So, when we say the last man, right, and this is probably part of that woke-ish thing that some people are talking about, but I think it's a bit overstated, is that when it's talked about someone being the quote-unquote last man on Earth or the last male on Earth, now these are just mammals, so there are other male species that exist in the world, but supposedly the idea is that showing the Y chromosome issue basically details that some people will say this means that gender or sex is irrelevant. I disagree. The whole point of this is that the Y chromosome, this specific part of the reproduction cycle of mammals, which is typically found in what we would identify as the male species or men, right? If half the species of any population disappears, it's trouble. But they do point out that because DNA can be so complex, and so can the, between the hormones and the reproductive changes that happen, and things that I'm not an expert in at all, it's not just the stereotypical man like myself that would have died that day. It would have been trans women, and it would have been women who had a Y chromosome and didn't know it, or anybody who had a Y chromosome. It definitely broadens the idea of humanity, if you think about it, because pointing out that, while there are very broad ranges that most of us operate under, it can be far more complex than we give it credit for. And the idea that there could be people who are, by all standards, women with the Y chromosome and could have died from this too. It's crazy. And one thing I think that the show kind of covers and that the book doesn't get into till far later is sort of, all of this happens, and you as the reader and the viewer are given a small sense of what may have caused it, but really you have no idea. And if you're in the world of this universe, right, you're definitely going to be probably paranoid and scared, because you're not 100% as to what happened. And one of the things that I think the show does really well is that it covers a different aspect of the apocalypse that I think is, far too often overlooked, and it might be a little wonky and boring and the political science nerd in me coming out, but this is only very briefly mentioned in the graphic novel, but in the show there's definitely a much greater focus on this. And again, I'm quoting the LA Times here because they've summed it up as well as I have. So, to give you a rough sense of what happened, so in the 5th episode of this series, and just a quick reminder of what happened. So, when all of the quote-unquote men die, the presidential line of succession basically is entirely decimated. And from 2002 to now, well, now obviously with Vice President Kamala Harris, the line wouldn't go so far down, but in this particular world that's been more reflective of the past, the first woman that comes into the line of succession is, in the graphic novels, the Secretary of Agriculture, who they paint as somebody who isn't necessarily qualified for the job, but isn't really a bad person. The TV show, however, I think gives an update in this sense, in that while the graphic novel is very clear early on about who is in charge in the line of succession, the show very much gives a much more chaotic scene, as one of the other characters in the show, Jennifer Brown, in the story, the mother of the last surviving man on Earth, ends up becoming president in the show due to, whatever series chain of events happens. So in the TV show, there is a much greater emphasis on the political power struggle. And, if you read the graphic novel, you're aware that there's basically a rough scene where a bunch of wives of former Republican office holders who died want to take their seats to help run the government. And unfortunately, Jennifer Brown and the other sticklers in government say that there are rules to follow, which there are. Normally, in a lot of times when, in the past, a spouse has died in Congress, the other spouse can take their place, but that usually results in a special election or appointment. And as the universe is already dictated in this sense, the vast majority of state governors were men and are now dead. So the idea of just what the remaining power structure is, going all the way down from the federal government to every local layer of government, shows how crazy it would be. But getting back to the TV show. In the TV show, there's a key power struggle that breaks out because another character named Regina Oliver, who is another low-ranking cabinet member, becomes the person who technically has a constitutional claim to the presidency. And the way that she's painted as a Marjorie Taylor Greene, MAGA type of Republican isn't totally off, especially with the Trump administration recently departing and the type of staff that was picked. 100% could see this happening. Also, one thing that I think is covered a little bit more is that, and again, this is going to be quoting the article here that talks about the differences. Unlike in the comics, where the Republican uprising was quickly resolved, and that essentially resulted in them working out a deal to figure out what happened, the political conflict still brews in the series, led by new characters created by the show. One person, conservative personality Kimberly Campbell Cunningham, played by actress Amber Tamblyn, the previous president's daughter, who was none too happy about being excluded from government decisions, has been trying to assemble allies in the Pentagon and sees Oliver's return as a blessing. For now, it appears neither Cunningham nor Oliver will be won over by President Brown, and it's unlikely that whatever they plan will be resolved as easily as the Republican dissent in the comics. So, this is true, right? And I definitely think that in this particular situation, if we were to just basically break it down into, how would this particular dynamic work in a constitutional crisis such as the vast majority of the government is now dead, and every department is now down to its female and trans male employees, which, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it's probably far less than what it would be if both genders are included. But I do think that this points out a very interesting dynamic in, what happens when the characters get together. And funny enough, Yorick Brown, the main character in the story, makes a similar reference where when the men are gone, he makes a joke that all the women become a kind of kumbaya society. And I suppose maybe I've heard this joke as well, where if only the men were gone and the women ran the world, it would be so much better. Well, in this story, they get the chance. Obviously not in a way that's actually, ideal. Nobody wants half the world to die all at once, suddenly. But seeing what happens in a world when men are removed, and I think the show does a good job in pulling up all these different female characters and women characters and trans characters who have to navigate what it means for them in a world where there's no longer in this case, the opposite sex with a Y chromosome. I guess I'm being careful here because in the novel, there's not a whole lot of talk about trans characters, except for some brief interactions and one quick soft story. But in the TV show, one of the minor characters from the novel is actually set up as a friend of another main character. The main guy, Yorick Brown, has a sister named Hero, who is kind of the family fuck-up. And she is friends with a transgender man named Sam. Now, I'm not 100% as to if this is the exact same scenario, but this looks like the character from the graphic novel that Yorick meets at the train station briefly, and then later gets more of a starring role in the side story about this all-female and trans man group of performers who are trying to, do plays in a post-male world. So, I will say that I don't think it's necessarily wrong or woke to ask yourself what happens to the trans characters in this story. Because if we're to, sort of game this out on our end of how this would work, if the Y chromosome is what kills people, so you have people walking around who, for the practical purposes of our society, look like, have the presentation of, and have documents that present them as male. And Sam, one of the characters, makes a good point during the show where he says that he has to explain a lot normally, and in this post-apocalyptic world, there's even more questions. And you can imagine that in a world where all this confusion and anger is happening between TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and in the series, a cult that takes that to the next level called the Daughters of the Amazon, along with maybe, more conservative leaning opinions, definitely give the sense of there's a more strict definition of the gender and the binary biological sex connection. So for a lot of them, having a lack of access to the medical care they may need, because if the vast majority of doctors have died, then who knows what's available, along with supplies and all the other stuff. So if you get a Walking Dead vibe from this, you probably should, because part of it is that people who help keep the electrical and the grid working all perish. Now, it's not a total collapse. There's still trains. There are different towns where, as it's pointed out, people are able to sort of figure it out on a smaller scale. And, it makes sense. In these kind of apocalyptic scenarios, your urban areas are going to be where most of the crazy things happen, and smaller areas, like in the show, they were able to actually come up on it. And this particular part I think is important too, and I want to get to it in a second, but I just want to cover real quick the rest of the differences between the TV show and the graphic novel, at least book one of the graphic novel, and then go into some deeper thoughts on it. So again, with help from this Los Angeles Times article, some key differences if you haven't read the graphic novel but have watched the show, there are differences between the two, and if you've read the novel and watched the show, you probably know already, but basically key differences is that in the graphic novel, a character named the Secretary of Agriculture, Margaret Valentine, becomes president, but in the TV show, Jennifer Brown becomes president. So the difference obviously being the commander-in-chief in a post-apocalyptic setting versus an advisor or someone closer to the president. Obviously they're all together, but still. Hero Brown, the older sister of the main character Yorick, has a bit of a change regarding not necessarily the entire character, but maybe the opening. But Hero tends to make some decisions that aren't necessarily great, and when the apocalypse does come, she ends up becoming part of a group called the Daughters of the Amazon, which is consistent. But the differences between her story in the book and the novel, there's a few. However, they does spend more time sort of getting to know Hero in the way she is, which I think is helpful as well. Sam Jordan. Yes, Sam Jordan, played by Elliot Fletcher, is a transgender man. Is, according to this, one of the characters created for the show. Now, again, I think, if I'm correct, there is a transgender man in the book, and I believe his name is Sam, and I believe they meet at a train station, and I believe he does kind of look very much like the character in the show. So I like to think it's not totally uninspired, but if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, but whatever. Anyway, the idea that you have a transgender friend, I think, is an aspect worth exploring. I'm sure a lot of people will say that, because of the way this is set up, is that, we don't necessarily have to talk about the trans characters as much because they feel that that's not really the point of the story. But, the world changed since 2002, and the differences and acknowledgement of trans rights and the science behind transitioning has definitely increased and provided a different outlook for... Sorry, I'm just going through the pages here, and I don't believe that Sam is mentioned in the first book. And I'm pretty sure I'm correct on that one, but whatever, I can double check later. Anyway, so Sam Jordan, interesting character. Agent 355, the African American secret agent. Cool in the book, cool in the show, badass, well crafted choice. So again, in the show, Agent 355 is tasked with guarding President Campbell and is seen helping to take out a small white supremacist terrorist cell. In the graphic novel, though, there's a much bigger story happening. She's retrieving an artifact from the country of Jordan. The artifact is called the Amulet of Helen, is in the series set up as one of the possible causes for the extinction event. And it definitely, as opposed to being with the president when he collapses in the show, 355 is on a plane when the plague happens, so he's able to survive, which is still a cool story. But here's where I get to another difference in the show that I am not 100% as to why this change was made, but whatever, I'm not here to judge, I guess. The main character, Yorick, has a girlfriend, Beth. In the graphic novel, Beth is in Australia, while Yorick is in Brooklyn, New York. In the TV show, Beth is in the United States at the same time as Yorick when everything goes down. Now, the reason I think I'm not 100% on board with this was that, in the novel, Beth being in Australia has a whole implication for Yorick trying to leave the United States and being the only woman he wants to find, despite the situation of being the last living biological Y chromosome human male. And part of the journey is that while he's working with the other two characters to get to a medical facility to try to help solve the crisis of, the lack of Y chromosomes, more time is spent trying to figure out exactly, how to get to Australia in Yorick's mind. And then there's another story with Beth, who's in Australia and has, has an encounter with some indigenous folks from Australia. In the TV show, Beth is here in the United States, ends up being able to get back to the White House to see Jennifer Brown, then apparently is part of a terrorist cell which helps break into the Pentagon and help topple, theoretically, the U.S. government. Results in Regina George being killed, and I guess the technical president of the United States at that point being shot. And it gives the implication that once the Pentagon has fallen, that the U.S. government has collapsed. Now, you can imagine when all the communication systems have broken down, that really rumors run rampant everywhere. And we're told in the show to believe that Jennifer Brown, the president, mother to Yorick and Hero, is dead, but she's not. She is, for some reason, held captive with Sam, Hero's transgender friend, and Beth, Yorick's fiance, in a secret room being monitored by another character who maybe is related to the Israeli commando Alter Leon, that is very prevalent in the first book, but has zero real mentions in the TV show. And one of the other military generals that was left as part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'm not 100% as to why that change was made, per se. I think that having his girlfriend / fiance be on a different continent, and the lack of real understanding as to what to do or how to get to her helps build the storyline, but, you know, who am I to judge? So that's kind of the basic breakdown of the show, and, you know, without getting into too much more details, because I want people to watch it and read the graphic novels. There are key differences between the two, but they do manage to converge, and I think in enough places to make the story work. The show was, as reported, canceled by FX for whatever reason, and, you know, I don't think it's because it was too woke, or don't think it was not woke enough. I'm assuming it probably has more to do with the fact that the series is from Vertigo, which is owned by DC, which is different from Marvel, which, as the Hulu ABC Marvel corporate merger wave concoction tells us, is that it's a different comic book, graphic novel, brand, franchise than the one that they are owned by. So maybe they didn't put the effort into it they should have, although I'm assuming that the pandemic probably forced them to make changes in terms of how they film it. I do think that the characters that they added, I think the story overall is improved. If they can keep some of the same components in place, I think that the show, if it does come back for season 2, if it keeps closer to the source material than away from it, it will do well. Again, it doesn't have to be a scolding reminder of the wokeness, because there is a broad range of diversity of opinions among survivors. Now, in the Last Man, Book 1, which is the first several issues, one of the main villains that we meet is a woman named Victoria, who is the self-proclaimed leader of the Daughters of the Amazon, a cult of women who exist post-plague and believe that this was intended, or nature wants the male chromosome to disappear. And, you know, they cut off one of their breasts because they believe an old myth that it helps them shoot a bow and arrow better, and you know, it's all sorts of crazy. It's people who are starving and looking for shelter and protection, and, you know, that sort of thing happens. So it's very interesting that, you know, when you see that the men are gone and women are left to figure things out among one another, that, you know, surprise, surprise, women are not a monolith and they don't all think the same. You know, there are those who would try to advocate for it's a good thing that the men are gone, and there are those who maybe cannot get over the fact that the men disappeared. One of the themes in the show, in the book, is, there are memorials set up in place by women for their fallen fathers, brothers, uncles, husbands, sons, nephews, all of that. And the Daughters of the Amazon and the radical people believe that they smash it all, trash it all of that nonsense. And they're your typical crazy villains. And I think that 100% is something that we always expect, is that there are villains who are predators, and in a world where civil society and rules are broken down and a more brutal natural order of things has sort of emerged, these people will try to rise from all of that and try to take control. So that's something I related to. What I will say, though, is that in the TV show, they give a backstory to Victoria. Victoria's character in the show is Nora, a woman who works for the President of the United States, who, before the passing, is a conservative Republican, and Nora is also a mother and a wife. So when the plague hits, she loses her husband and her son and is left to care for her daughter, which in the show results in them having to leave their home and meet up with this group of Daughters of the Amazon in what is an old Costco warehouse, essentially, led by a woman named Roxanne, who is missing a breast, and we are led to believe is an ex-police officer, but only to find out she's not. She's just a former manager of the store, or assistant manager of the store, and sort of takes on this new persona after the plague happens and gets a bunch of women from domestic violence shelters to join her. So again, that tracks. That's something that I definitely think could happen, and I think trying to give Victoria an origin story is helpful. And there are some people who say we don't need to give every villain an origin story, which is true, but I think for the purposes of trying to expand a creative universe and knowing that not every person comes from it just straight up evil, that understanding why a woman like Victoria, who in the novel comes off as very anti-men, you look at this person and you would get a sense of, you've probably seen them on a college campus before, but in the show, she's a mother who loses it and is tired of, using her skills to deal with a world where men were in charge, and now men are gone. She's got to make stuff happen. I will say, though, at the very end of the series, as they get closer towards, and it does track with the end of the book, but essentially the main character, Yorick, and his friends come upon a small town where everything seems to be in working order and it's populated by women. They have electricity. Now, the reason being is that they go to a place that was a town next to a women's correctional facility. And obviously once the plague happened, the male guards died and the female guards couldn't handle everything and they just left. So these women built their own community in the remaining places and sort of have a good thing going. Key differences here, which I really liked in the book and wasn't necessarily opposed to in the show, but I think it could have been done better, is sort of the last showdown. In the novel, we find out that Victoria learns of the existence of Yorick, the last man, and goes with her cult members, including Yorick's sister Hero, to hunt him down. Same thing happens in the show, except Victoria is not introduced yet. She's still Nora, and Roxanne, the crazy lady, is still leading them. And instead of just trying to capture the man, they show up and they engage in a gunfight with the residents of the town. And they lose, and they're forced to retreat. Now, maybe there was something in the next season that would have resolved this, but in the show, after they get to this town, basically they attempt to kill Yorick and almost do, but Yorick is saved by another woman whom he has developed feelings for. This woman is killed by his sister. So in the book, it's a very fast, traumatic, and brutal experience. But in the TV show, Yorick, the main character, is escaping, and his sister Hiro finds him. But instead of it being this dramatic confrontation between the main villain, his sister, and him, another crony of hers is displayed and kills Yorick's girlfriend from the town, also ironically named Beth. And Hiro then kills this woman, although in the novel, Beth, the woman Yorick sees from the town, who is not his girlfriend, is another woman named Beth, and I'm going to double check that to confirm, because with all these different names here, I sometimes get confused. But one of the tricks of the show is that Yorick basically meets a Beth everywhere he goes. But basically, before Victoria tries to kill Yorick, Yorick is killed by the girl who likes him. Sorry, Victoria is killed by the girl who likes Yorick before he gets the chance, and then Hiro kills the girl and Beth. And I'm sorry, I got the book in front of me and I should have written all this down, but what are you going to do? The town is Marysville, Ohio. That's where the town is, and it's relevant because they're from Ohio originally, the Brown family, and Jennifer Brown, the congresswoman, is from Ohio, so they know the area. I don't know, I get it. The shootout was cool, but why they would have allowed them to escape, and how Nora shoots Roxanne and then becomes Victoria seems a little forced or a little rushed in my mind. But if they want to create origin stories for these different characters and they want to include it more, that's fine. I will say the component that really got me though was seeing the kind of drama that's happening in DC, and I definitely think that the TV show paints it in a far more realistic scenario than what happens in the graphic novel. Whereas in the graphic novel, president's in charge, Republican women show up and shoot up the White House with guns because they want to, take advantage of things that are owed to them. In the TV show, the White House is actually overrun, even though they're not in there, and because they're all in the Pentagon for a meeting when the event happens, they're already locked into place, which, knowing what was going to happen, the Pentagon may have been probably the best option for them to be at, and the Pentagon becomes the new center of government operations. As I mentioned earlier, in this TV show, Beth, Yorick's girlfriend, is not in Australia, but in fact infiltrates inside of the Pentagon to help a group of radical activists overthrow the government. And, it's a very tense standoff, and it's really well done, and I liked how it ended. But, the uncertainty to the end, and I'm sure this was going to be their attempt to bring in a woman who is supposedly the Israeli agent Altair Leon, then, cool. The second season would have been super helpful for that. But, at least in my mind, if you're going to introduce characters like that, maybe try to make it, a little more connected. And you know what? Hey, if they realized that trying to do all of it at once was too much, and they were going to break it down through different seasons and have different episodes following different characters, so instead of it being different blurbs and different issues, they could break it down over time, by all means, go ahead and do so. I think that wouldn't be a bad idea. I just don't want the show to sort of fall into the trap of, feeling like it's either got to push to be more quote-unquote woke, or try to change the original source material beyond its, intended meaning. Because although it's been almost 20 years since it came out, in a sad way, it's not necessarily a whole lot different. While progress has been made, the gender imbalance and a lot of the things I just mentioned, including government and electrical jobs and pilots, these are all still here. Barriers are being broken, and with the trans community and the non-binary community becoming more active and present in our understandings of gender, the social constructs behind that, and its connection to biological sex all continue to be analyzed and debated, but I definitely think that their story is one worth telling, because there is nobody who would be well prepared for this apocalypse, I suppose, unless of course you were just a survivalist in general. But if you're somebody who is going through gender transition and you live in a world where everyone around you knows that the Y chromosome has disappeared, and you very much look like someone with the Y chromosome, that kind of tension is always going to be there. And I wouldn't want that for anybody. Nobody should want to have to go through that. But no, I don't think that, spending too much time on trans characters makes the show too woke. I definitely think it makes the show more realistic. What I will say, though, is I definitely wanted to get more knowledge of what happens with the conservative women, because, we get the sense from the show and a bit from the novel that the women who are left in charge of the government when this happens are the quote-unquote Rachel Maddow types. There's that perception that these women who are, anti-men and they're anti-kids and they have these weird feminist theories, and, that kind of attitude is definitely prevalent, and I think that attitude wouldn't go away. But I also think that there is a real concern that as positions of power and government and different fields of industry continue to diversify, particularly when it comes to gender, what does that mean? Obviously, men are not a monolith, and therefore women are not a monolith. What would it mean for these different groups of women to come together when circumstances are changed, and maybe they traditionally have not had nor have had the ability to make big, powerful decisions, but now are thrust to? How would anybody do in those scenarios? But one of the themes of the book overall, and I agree with this, is that while things are terrible for a long time, eventually they're able to figure it out. Whether it's through cloning and nature's asexual reproduction and different methods of trying to help save the population, along with other parts of the story which involves other men who survived, and a whole other crazy story about that. And that's why I love the books. Just read the graphic novels, or watch the playlist that I've included in the description. It's fantastic. It's really well written, really connects, and there's so much stuff going on, and I cannot recommend it enough. But the point being is that a show where it's all women for the most part, except for the one male character. And again, some people are saying that it's not woke enough, quote unquote, because it's not about a world of women, it's about a man. The name of the show is The Last Man. So the character is the last, quote unquote, man. And while that's a reference to Yorick or ampersand, up to you, but I think we both know what it means. And it's not as if the premise of that is, men disappeared and therefore it was a better place. Like, it was a violent plague that attacked people specifically based on, a genetic component. And And if you watch the most recent Bond film, which again, spoilers for that too, a DNA-based weapon is not something entirely made up, but, you know, the idea that something could happen and kill all the men all at once is a terrifying thought, I will say that. You know, I think we all live in a world where escapism matters, and you have to find something that really drives your passion. My wife was always more into graphic novels than I was, and she's got a bunch, and we've watched, you know, different animated versions of those, or booted versions of those as well, and if they're well done, you know, they can be really good. And, you know, like The Boys is able to provide both a commentary on culture while also be an entertaining show. I definitely think that The Last Man, through its original source material and through an updated TV show version, can give us that same kind of emotional catharsis and wonder. Because, I mean, as a matter of me personally speaking, if you've watched one apocalyptic show or movie, you've seen almost all the apocalyptic shows or movies. You know, what would you do if you're in an urban area and all of a sudden a virus breaks out and kills most of the people around you, or it's urban chaos, or it's The Happening and the trees start to kill you? You know, we all think that we would probably do better in crisis and chaos than we actually do. And I think the last year, the pandemic definitely showed that when shit does hit the fan, a lot of people may think that they're prepared, but they're not. A lot of people may think they're not prepared, but they can step up to the moment as well. But I think it's more so the other way around. A lot of people would not be prepared for it. And in this scenario, you know, if you're me and you have the Y chromosome, you're not York or ampersand, hey, the story's over for you, right? And it looks pretty quick. It looks like you're here, you're bleeding, you die. And that's the end of the story. Granted, all that other stuff happens afterwards, but in that scenario, in an ironic way, the patriarchy is crafty because the men die and the women have to clean up the mess. But what would happen in this post-apocalyptic world where the Y chromosome is removed? And again, we sort of briefed it earlier, but depending on where you live, you know, and what state or country you're in, your recognition as a quote-unquote man is based on your residency and your citizenship and passports. So in a post-apocalyptic world, will there be social justice warriors still arguing over the terms man and women, particularly when half the population dies off catastrophically? Probably. That tends to happen. I think the last pandemic has shown us that when people are in crisis, for the most part, we all can pitch in and work together and try to make things happen. But, you know, some people break, and some people take hold of misinformation and fear and don't help or hinder or make things worse. That's human nature, I guess. And I think that's why I like the novels, the graphic novels, and I like the show, is that, you know, we maybe have these expectations of human nature, particularly, you know, maybe we all feel like gender and sex has this sort of really, really strict confines that not everybody fits into, but as a general rule, exists for a reason. But I also think women are vastly far more complex and diverse than they're often given credit for, and I think it's very often when it's just painted as, you know, you read exit polls and it's how do women vote and how do white women versus women of color, and how do educated women versus non-educated, or women with college degrees and or don't have college degrees, and who are mothers and who are single and who are married. And, you know, people are people, and gender and sex are part of that equation. I've sort of come to this conclusion of three basic not really rules, but I guess my general ideas to help kind of make this easier. We don't have to be woke about it. We don't have to be crazy about it. In my mind, men and women are equal. Men and women are complementary. And men and women are different. I think all three of those things are true. I think all three of those things feed into one another. And while a lot of people I've seen will try to basically go into the very, very, in the super early stages of development, it can go either way. Yeah, sure, obviously, right? But eventually it does go one way or the other, at least for most of us. And if it doesn't, and there are, different cases, we should obviously be open to everything. But I think for the most part, we know that for human beings, we tend to break up among men and women, whatever those definitions are, usually based on your state and whatever your birth certificate says or what you change it to. But I think we should try to keep the show alive. I think it's important to have more shows where all women are the cast, because I think it helps us realize that maybe if we think in monoliths or stereotypes, that we shouldn't, I think there is this kind of assumption that, once all the boys are together, boys are always boys, and that may be true in some cases, but, people, and I think individuality, as someone who really believes in someone's individual rights, we don't all fit into every box, and human psychology sometimes tells us we have to, because we're group animals and we want to be part of the group. Sometimes the group is wrong, and sometimes the group does not have your best interest in mind, and the group loses itself into mob rule and chaos. Sometimes the mob comes after you because you exist, and because they decided because of things like your gender or your race, that you can or can't do something with no real basis for it. But, women are equally capable of all the jobs men do. I honestly don't think that, I remember reading that infamous Google memo a few years ago, written by one of the engineers at Google, who talked about his theory on why the gender balance was how it was in tech. And it's not like he was malicious or anything like that, but I just think that the assumption that we're making with both the genders, and the show kind of shows it, is that, we're in this together, and we need to understand each other. And if we were all if the other half were to disappear one day, it would be very sad and very difficult, and it'd be a very complex situation to try to work through. But if anything, this show helps break down how, we may feel about women under pressure, how we may feel about women when men are not around. And of course, as I said, women are capable, they're equal, they're different, and they're complementary, which is a term that I've heard more so from the religious side, and as someone who's not particularly religious but reads other more religious, political, conservative figures and how their understanding works, it's not totally without merit. I very much get a yin-yang scenario out of this, and I think that this particular show helps explain how balances are bad either way. And later on, there's a reference to China, and way towards the end of the book, and obviously with China having its over male populated situation, these are real questions we have, and we can always break it down into more advanced gender issues, but I don't think that's necessary. I just think that the show should be picked up by a service that's willing to invest in the storyline and make it work, because there's a lot of components in it, and if it's done well, I think as a visual experience, I think it'd be great. I think the casting choices were great. I think adding the new characters in is a good spin. Not a fan of everything, but again, I'm not the creators. The creators apparently signed off on it, so if they like it, then it's up to them. But if you like the podcast, thanks for listening. Like, share, comment, subscribe. All links are in the description, and I've got stuff to do today, so hopefully we'll get this up soon. Take care, y'all. Peace.